Good evening, everybody. My name is Dave Dancic, and I am a member of the board here at Hill Center. Welcome, everyone. I want to first ask you all to take your phones out of your pocket and turn off the sound. Don't be that guy. I also want to encourage you all, when you go home tonight, to visit the website for the Hill Center and see all the fabulous things that are happening around here. We have coming up the American Roots concert series, New Dangerfield with DC's own Jake Blunt on October 19th. We have the Pottery on the Hill event, which is always a fan favorite. You can get some Christmas gifts, holiday gifts for your friends and family. At the end of the discussion, we'll have a brief opportunity for some Q&A. I would just ask for you to wait until you get the microphone. We're being recorded, and so you need to talk into the microphone. Tonight, we're lucky enough to have two gentlemen who, for very different reasons, have had a front row seat to the recent goings-on at the FBI. Over here, we have Devlin Barrett, New York Times reporter who covers the Justice Department and the FBI. He's also the author of a great book. I read it. October Surprise, How the FBI Tried to Save Itself and Crashed an Election, about the 2016 election. How quaint. And behind me over here, we have Michael Feinberg. Michael had a long and storied career at the FBI, focusing primarily on national security investigations. And most recently, he was serving as the deputy director of the Norfolk Field Office. He's a recipient of the FBI's highest commendation, the Director's Award for Excellence. So without further ado, gentlemen, we hope to hear more from you about the Comey indictment than Attorney General Bondi was willing to share with Senator Durbin at the hearings yesterday. So welcome.
Thank you. Mike, how you doing?
Good, thank you.
So apologies, it's been a slow news week. We're going to cancel the event. You can all go home. Obviously, it's been a very busy week, especially in the things that we care about and cover. I have a lot of questions for Mike, and we have a lot to talk about. But I think the obvious thing to start with is what happened this morning. The former director of the FBI, James Comey, appeared in federal court for his arraignment. Mike, I'm really very curious what meaning you see in this moment. What are your thoughts on that?
So I don't know that I have anything to share that any educated person in the United States can't figure out themselves about the actual mechanics of what happened this morning. I mean, I don't think anybody is surprised that he pled not guilty. I don't think anybody is surprised that there is going to be a flurry of pretrial motions, looking at things like selective and vindictive prosecution and trying to disqualify or to dismiss the indictment for reasons having to do with Lindsay Halligan's, let's say, unconventional appointment. But what's really interesting to me and what I haven't seen discussed in really any forum or any reporting on the topic is what are going to be the second and third order consequences of this indictment, even if it fails. And what I mean by that is that the FBI, at least up until this past January, very much had a role in the investigative and prosecutorial community of the United States, in which it was sort of the one who guarded the guards themselves. If there was a corrupt politician or an illegal law enforcement action, the FBI was the organization that investigated that. And now that a director of the FBI has been indicted for investigating allegations against a president and his circle, even if the case gets dismissed and goes nowhere, there's going to be really perverse disincentives going forward for future directors to take a stand in terms of what is right and show a willingness to investigate the politically powerful. That's going to have ramifications for the health of our polity that they're certainly not more important to the Comey family, I imagine, than his fate, but they're really going to impact the nation at large and our future path as a representative democracy in a way that I don't think a lot of people are fully yet appreciating.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck this week actually by a different thing that happened, which was a bunch of Republican senators. I don't know how much folks absorb this because it's a little weedy, but a bunch of Republican senators publicly went on the attack against the FBI earlier this week over what they said was spying by the FBI, what some of them called wiretapping, which is not an accurate description of the FBI, on 9 Republican lawmakers for their toll phone records around the time of the January 6th riot. And that, to me, to your point, I think that was really instructive of sort of like the new normal for the political fights around the FBI, because in many ways what the Republicans were arguing is, one, the FBI did a terrible thing by taking our phone records. Two, implicit in that criticism and attack is a significant misrepresentation of what actually happened. When you take someone's phone records, you do not know what was said in the calls. You are not listening to the calls. You are finding out who called who when and how long did they talk for. And so misrepresentation seemed to be baked into a lot of what they were saying in real time as to what they were upset about. And that seems to be really, I think, a big part of a lot of the attacks on the Bureau. I think one thing I should flag up front, because otherwise this might get a little confusing. I'm a reporter. Mike worked at the FBI. My job is not to defend the FBI. I don't think I've ever actually defended the FBI.
No, I can speak from reading your stories over the entirety of my career. You are not playing defense for us. Yes.
Right. So Mike, I think honestly and quite fairly, would defend many of the things the Bureau has done and many of the things the Bureau has stood for a very long time, and I get that. But just as sort of a baseline understanding, there are things we don't agree on in this, and there are things that I would not do, as a reporter, to say like, well, this is right or this is wrong or those sorts of things. I think the Bureau is an incredibly important institution in American life. It is an incredibly powerful institution in American life. It is also under attack for that very reason in some ways, and I think the consequences of it coming under attack, what comes out the other side, to your point, are hugely important. And so what was striking to me about this outrage that the Republicans were expressing about the phone records is the political forces attacking the Bureau are more and more pushing the implicit argument, and sometimes explicit, that the Bureau should just not investigate certain things or certain people. That is often not spoken, but very clear in a lot of what the argument is being made. Now, I think there are plenty of good and healthy public debates to have about what should be a good reason to investigate, for the FBI to investigate, and what should be a bad reason for someone to investigate. I think that is, at the core of why we talk about the FBI in the first place. But I am really struck by the degree to which the Bureau is under attack for essentially a basic premise of what they do, which is, as long as I've covered them, which is more than 20 years at this point, the Bureau has always been the place that does the cases that no one else can do. And I think, to your point, Mike, the danger becomes at some point that the Bureau simply may not do those types of cases anymore, period.
I don't think that's the danger. I think that's the explicit goal. And I think I'm going to go through a couple points that may seem disconnected, but I promise you at the end there will be a common thread. I I want to talk briefly about the two investigations that have put the Bureau under fire the most since Trump became president in 2016, and that is the Robert Mueller special counsel investigation, and it folded within that the Crossfire Hurricane universe of cases that both were looking at alleged ties between the Trump campaign and Russia, and the second case being the January 6th investigations. So I would be remiss in my duties as somebody who worked in the counterintelligence division during the first series of cases and was a supervisor in the Washington field office who was involved in the January 6th investigation if I didn't point a few things out. With respect to the Russia investigation, the Bureau received credible information from one of our partner nations, and I'm not talking about a temporal partner. I'm talking about a Five Eyes. Five Eyes is an intelligence sharing pact between the English-speaking nations of the world. And we received information from them that members of the Trump campaign had been in active communication with representatives of the Russian government about releasing Hillary Clinton's emails in a way to benefit the Trump campaign. If the FBI gets a lead that U.S. persons are conspiring with a foreign government to influence the outcome of our presidential elections, they would be completely remiss if they didn't look at it. And I'd also point out, it was not handled, despite what people are saying, in an overtly or even implicitly political way. It was never leaked. The media generally did not have an idea it was going on for most of the investigation's duration. Nobody tried to make political hay out of it. There were errors made in aspects of the investigation, and I think we would probably have a healthy debate over the severity of those errors. But, the Bureau had to look at those allegations. It would be derelict in its duties if it didn't. Ditto for January 6th. There was a concerted effort, and this is not something that should be controversial to say at this point, by segments of one of our political parties to overturn or otherwise hamstring the results of a fair and free election. And there were false elector schemes. There was the egging on of protesters, which turned into a full-on riot or insurrection, depending how you want to characterize it. And involved in those schemes were a number of members of Congress. This isn't controversial. There were members of Congress who refused to certify the results of the election simply because their side lost. That's not healthy in a democracy. I mean, that should be an understatement. And it did come very close, if not explicitly, into criminal activity. And once again, the FBI had a duty to look at it. And if you're a congressman or a congresswoman or a senator, and you have concerns that the FBI may someday look at the metadata of your communication, I would humbly suggest you should try and avoid getting involved in criminal conspiracies. That is the easiest way to avoid this sort of outcome. So I want to talk about, there is an attempt to undermine the very mission of the FBI, not because of a principled objection to that mission per se, but because its personnel have leveraged its authorities in ways that are politically inconvenient for some in power. And we see this across the entire Justice Department. Very early on in the administration, there were a number of statutes that that DOJ just said, we're not enforcing anymore. 951, that's shorthand for a statute that involves acting as an agent of a foreign power. That's off the books now. That's just not something DOJ is interested in. The Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is a law that governs the foreigners' abilities to lobby members of Congress or the executive branch for political ends. That's something we've just said we're not really going to enforce. The FBI disbanded, under Dan Bongino and Kash Patel, its Foreign Influence Task Force. DOJ eviscerated the Public Integrity Section, which handles public corruption investigations. The Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division explicitly said, we're going to go lighter on white-collar crime because it's bad for American business. Now, all of these laws and changes that I've mentioned, I would suggest it is not coincidental that these are the very statutes that were used to prosecute Trump allies during the first term. So, this isn't accidental. This isn't a general argument against government overreach. This is attempting to take out an insurance policy to make sure that the FBI and DOJ will not get in the way of the administration this time around.
Yeah, and a couple things on that point. One, there's a fascinating lawsuit that was filed by 3 former very senior FBI officials, which really lays out, I think, the best and most extensive argument I think I've seen as to this question of politicization of the FBI. And the thing that's most striking to me about that lawsuit is there's a section in there where one of the senior fired officials describes a conversation with Kash Patel, in which Kash Patel says a number of things that would be, I think, upsetting to anyone who came into the Bureau. But really, one of the things he says is, according to the lawsuit, is that Kash Patel, will be fired unless he fires everyone associated with the Trump cases, and that it simply wasn't ultimately important whether or not those FBI agents were fired with good reason or for whether or not they'd done anything wrong or not. That was simply Patel's instruction, and that's what he intended to do, because otherwise he himself, Patel, would be fired. And just this week, we saw a handful of agents fired as a result, ostensibly, of having done this phone toll records work. I will just point out that one of the things that is so sort of and I said before, my job isn't to defend the Bureau or the Justice Department. I do think my job is to defend reality and accuracy, to be clear. And it is a just fact of reality that the reason those phone records were looked at to begin with was to understand what Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani were telling and asking and demanding of those lawmakers right around January 6th, and including this was already in the January 6th indictment, that even after the riot, Giuliani and Trump are pushing those lawmakers to stop the certification. Even after everything has gone to hell in this city, they're still engaged in the pressure campaign to try to essentially stop the certification that the writers were themselves trying to stop. And I think it is a weird feature of how this stuff plays out now in the political space that, frankly, this investigative step, which everyone has known about for years at this point. I mean, think about the absurdity of declaring that you've just discovered this thing when the people running the Justice Department are Donald Trump's former criminal lawyers who have all of this stuff in the case file of discovery that they got, when they were defending the president in the criminal case. It is sort of a bizarro world to try to present this as new, damning, crazy information. And I think the fact that this was known and understood by the people running the department itself speaks to what Patel is accused of saying in that lawsuit, which is, my job is to fire people who worked on Trump cases. And, to me, this week is another example of how you can build all of these Lego houses of conspiracies as to what happened, but if you just watch the behavior, it's pretty clear what they're doing and why they're doing it, and how that is fundamentally changing. This is the other thing I want to get back to with you, is it feels to me like they're fundamentally changing how the Bureau functions. Do you think that's right?
What I have told a million people, and it's a very common refrain in the Bureau, I did not make this up, I heard it from others, like, the Bureau I joined, and this is what I have said and it's what other people have said, the Bureau I joined no longer exists. It just doesn't.
Can you just explain that? Like, how so?
The Bureau is supposed to be, and it has not always, it has often fallen short in this goal, particularly in its early years, but from time to time thereafter. But the Bureau I joined and that I served for nearly 2 decades really did strive to be totally apolitical. Everybody, the Republicans, for example, talk about how much pressure we put on Trump. They ignore the fact that during the same time period, we investigated Bob Menendez, and indicted him in prison. We investigated and indicted Eric Adams. That story is to be continued.
Not in prison.
Like, we were sort of equal opportunity persecutors, for lack of a better. I should phrase it differently than that. But my point is, like, we really did operate solely based upon predicated facts. And, where did those facts lead us? Did they end up in an indictment? Cool, we'll get the indictment. Do they end up in an exoneration? Okay, the person didn't do it. We don't deserve the indictment. Like, you sort of just played your hand straight. And that's sort of gone. And it's gone for a few reasons. The first is DOJ, by virtue of the fact that it has so many more political appointees than the FBI, is just a more overtly political organization. And there are things they have straight up just said they're not going to prosecute anymore. If you are a member of a right-wing militia, if you are committing civil rights abuses, these are areas where people get a free pass for the next few years. And again, I'm not revealing any secrets here. This is explicit in the choices they've made of what to resource and what to prosecute. So that if the FBI, we can't prosecute cases ourselves. So they're really hobbling our ability to look into those violations of laws. I can investigate a domestic terrorist, but if I don't have a prosecutor willing to present an indictment to a grand jury, my investigation has zero effect. I can look at a pattern in practice violation of civil liberties by a local police department, but if DOJ is not willing to pursue a consent decree, I could find 1 million violations and it won't matter. So in that sense, the FBI has been hobbled. But in a greater sense, they have shown zero compunction whatsoever about pushing anybody out who shows the slightest amount of resistance, who just had the misfortune to be made an executive under Chris Wray during the Biden administration, or in my own case, who is friends with somebody they find politically suspect.
Yeah, and can you just explain that? Because they're not on the blogs. Everyone here isn't on the blogs the way I'm on the blogs. Can you just explain what happened in your case?
Yeah, so basically, I worked counterintelligence my entire career. From day one up until the day I left, I was resolutely focused on identifying and, through various means, neutralizing the efforts of foreign spies. One of the individuals, when I first came to headquarters, was a senior executive whose name is now familiar for other reasons, named Pete Strzok. He sent a number of text messages that were incredibly critical of President Trump using his bureau phone in what even he would politely characterize as a mistake. And, he was fired for it eventually. But he was somebody who was very much a mentor to me before any of that happened, early in my career, later in his. And we discovered that we had a lot of commonalities totally outside of the job. Mainly, we became friends because we discovered we liked the same bands and we're both horribly pretentious foodies. So our friendship, I'm not exaggerating, consisted entirely of going to concerts at the 930 Club or the Lincoln Theater and trying new restaurants. That friendship continued after he was fired for a number of years. The friendship changed in that we never talked about work stuff again because he wasn't read into anything and he didn't have a need to know. He was on the outside. But, like, yeah, we went to a Morrissey concert together. I think we saw Depeche Mode. Like, it was, just two aging, obnoxious hipsters trying to relive their youth.
A Gen X love story.
Yeah. Somehow Dan Bongino found out about this, and it was made clear to me in a series of phone calls over a period of about 8 hours that my career was over. I was not going to receive a promotion which I was in for, which I had been explicitly told by the hiring managers was mine. I was in fact going to get demoted, which within the Bureau, if you don't know this, if you're an assistant special agent in charge and you get demoted, you generally are not allowed to stay in the field office you're currently at. My wife was 7.5 months into an incredibly high-risk pregnancy, and I was not willing to make her move to a new part of the country and deal with finding a new medical practice and new support network and everything that comes with that at that point in time. And I was also told that I was at the very least going to be polygraphed and possibly investigated for my relationship with Pete. Now look, I'll delve a little bit into my background because I think it provides some useful context. I'm not an ideologue, but to the extent you could put me on a political map, I'm somebody who up until 2016 was almost a straight ticket Republican voter. I was the vice president of my law school's Federalist Society chapter. My first legal clerkship was with a conservative public interest firm here in D.C. I am not the sort of person that you think of them going after for ideological or political reasons. But the mere fact that I was friends with somebody who they deemed a political enemy was enough to destroy my career, regardless of what effect that would have on my life or, frankly, more importantly, the organization. So, I worked Chinese spy cases. There aren't a lot of experts in that country in the FBI. I didn't know anybody else at my level who also spoke Mandarin the way I did. But none of that mattered. I got on a list, and so I was gone. So there's been a lot of that going on. There's been turnover, like at this point, probably around 40 or 50% of the special agents in charge throughout the country have been forced out and replaced with new individuals, and they're being very canny about how they do it. The persons who are getting promoted to be special agent in charge under Patel and Bongino are invariably people whose pensions have not vested and who are not eligible for retirement. What that means in practical terms is if they push back, they get fired and lose their retirement plan. So they're purposely stocking the senior-most positions with people who have a financial motivation to roll over.
So, yeah, and I would just note that the bureau culture has a specific term for the people who have hit their 20.
KMA.
KMA, which is short for kiss my ass. Meaning, once you hit your 20, you are suddenly less worried about the boss being mad at you. And you suddenly have a lot more opinions about what you're doing and what you're not doing.
And if I could jump in, that was something that institutionally was always viewed as a strength. Right. The director of the FBI, whomever it was at any given point, very much wanted senior executives who would push back. there's a limit to it, obviously, and there's a chain of command, but you wanted to encourage dissenting voices because that's the only way you hear good arguments.
And one of the things that I will say my profession struggles to explain and convey well to readers and the public is there is no investigation. I don't think I've ever covered any investigation of any consequence that did not involve disagreements or disputes somewhere along the way of conducting the investigation, the prosecution. I have written plenty of stories about, this agent yelled at this prosecutor, this agent yelled at that agent, and I worry, to be honest, that that information never lands quite the right way, which is that's part of the process. Dissent, disagreement, disputes, you hash it out in order to get to a better result. I think one of the ways in which what's happening at the Justice Department and the Bureau is very different now is that the message has gone down from the Attorney General. It was one of her very first memos that there will be no dissent. And, for lawyers and agents who have come up in that system, like Mike, that's genuinely a completely different environment and a completely different way of approaching the job. If you are afraid that you will get fired for arguing a point in a case, maybe you don't argue that point that day. Maybe you don't argue that point that month, and maybe the case doesn't succeed because you didn't have it out, you didn't hash it out. And look, I'm always fascinated when there's a media story, just to stay an outsider for a minute. I'm always fascinated when there's a media story that says oh, there was an argument in the newsroom about X story. I'm like, well, yeah, there was a story, so there was definitely an argument about it. We don't just agree. We're not agreeable people. That's not how anything works. I think one of the ways in which the culture of these institutions are under tremendous pressure is, as a general rule of thumb, again, keeping my outsider hat on, which I can't take off, the Bureau, I think is made up of mostly people who would probably fall somewhere on the conservative-ish.
I would call it a center-right organization, yeah.
And I think the Justice Department, similarly, a lot of the lawyers would fall into sort of a center-left type posture. That doesn't actually matter 99% of the time in anything. It can if you're getting in sort of a 49-51 type case and you're sort of well, this guy feels wrong to me, but I can't quite put my finger on it. But as a general rule, I would say as an overwhelming rule in the majority of cases, it's never a factor. It never affects anything. And to the degree it affects anything, it's actually often, as someone covering it, I find it often helps the process because you have different perspectives that get applied to the facts of a case. And sometimes you hash it, like I said, you have disagreements, you hash it out, and you get to a better result. What is happening now at the Justice Department and the Bureau, I think, is people are trying to learn how to do those same difficult jobs and those same difficult cases in an environment in which disagreement may be punished with, punishment or dismissal.
But you can't do the job in that environment. And that's what people need to understand. The Bureau literally has the power to deprive people of their freedom and, in certain circumstances, of their lives. You need to have people checking your assumptions, challenging your courses of action, and second-guessing your decisions to make sure that before you put those handcuffs on somebody and inalterably change their life, or before you pull that trigger and end that life, you are damn sure you are doing the right thing. And if you don't have dissent, you lose the greatest check on that power possible. I spent the entire latter half of my career in supervisory or managerial positions in the FBI. There was literally never a week where one of my subordinates didn't yell at me about something. And I didn't mind. That's literally part of the job. You want to hire people who are smarter than you so they can challenge you and you can learn from them. And part of that is dealing with them when they push back and disagree with you. And if the culture of dissent, if the culture of challenging authority is gradually sanded away, you have an organization of yes men. And if you have an organization of yes men, they are not the sort of people who are going to do what's right in a difficult situation.
Right, and I think one of the ways in which the bureau is changing and the department is changing is this insistence. A lot of these people are being fired on the premise that the White House and or Justice Department leadership has lost faith that the person will be loyal to the president's agenda. That's sort of the language that tends to get used. You see that in the lawsuit by the senior FBI officials. You also see that in a lot of the written decisions firing people. That is an extremely vague definition of anyone, I think. Like, what does loyalty look like for an SSA agent who's like a low-level supervisor in a field office? I even on the face of it, I mean, I think you can definitely argue the merits of, like, that is not a good reason to fire anybody. But even on the face of it, I don't know how you even make that judgment.
So I've got one factual point to make of that and one philosophical one. The factual point is people need to understand, if you are a special agent or an intel analyst or even a supervisory special agent overseeing a squad, you have zero say in the cases you work. They get assigned to you. So saying that the individuals who investigated January 6th were on some sort of political crusade is just at odds with reality. They were sitting at their desk when the supervisor walked by with a lead that he or she needed to assign to somebody. That's just the job. So that's the factual point. The philosophical one, the notion that law enforcement should have some sort of loyalty to the executive leader of the country is not an uncommon notion. The problem is it's really common in countries and eras which we generally don't want to emulate. I've been thinking a lot about this for something I'm working on myself in terms of writing, but like there is a continuum of law enforcement that on the one hand has law enforcement agencies, and then somewhere a little bit farther down a certain road you have a security service, and then farther down the road than that you have a secret police force. And what really gets you from point A over to point C is when people stop caring about neutral principles and constitutional norms and they start caring instead, what does our leader think about this course of action? This is, like, I struggle to articulate it because I feel it on such an emotionally resonant level. Like, this is a very dangerous point, not that we're heading towards, but that we have already passed. When agents are getting fired for investigating the president's political allies, when investigations for bribery that have been videotaped are getting shut down because it's a member of the executive branch, when applicants are being asked about their political loyalties, we are not trending toward an authoritarian force. We are at one. And people really need to understand how dire the situation our nation currently faces with respect to its law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Like, the working level very much wants to hold the line. I mean, I don't know a line level special agent who doesn't take his or her oath to the Constitution almost more seriously than anything else in their life. Just to give you an anecdote that's going to make me look like a bad person, when I was deciding to resign, my wife just sort of said matter-of-factly, yeah, I remember when we first started dating, you told me that your oath to the Constitution would always come before me. And like, now to be clear, like, I have no memory of saying this, but it is entirely the sort of thing my more callow, youthful version would say. But like the working level wants to fight this. The problem is the senior leaders who have been appointed by the White House and the people they're choosing to promote are willing to make compromises for personal benefit. And I cannot, look, I don't want to be spending my life criticizing the FBI and the Department of Justice.
That's my job.
Yeah. I assure you there are things I would rather be doing. I have like piles of DVDs and books. I want to stay home and binge them. Like, this is not my idea of a really good time. But it's really important for the citizenry to know what's happening to the institutions that are supposed to serve them. And quite frankly, for a wide variety of reasons, not enough people are standing up and talking about it.
Speaking of standing up and talking about it, I think we may have reached the point in the program where we should take a few questions.
So this has been just quite an extraordinary, wonderful, everything that we could possibly have hoped for. So does anyone have a question? Okay, let's try to keep it.
How thrilled do you think Beijing and Moscow are at seeing this administration do their work for them in terms of weakening the government?
Over the moon. Which one do you want me to address first? Like, I could wax ecstatic about this for hours. Look, Russia pretty much now has a free hand. NATO knows it has much less support than it has ever had in the history of its existence from the United States. Russia is the most adept at running foreign influence operations against the United States, and we have purposefully dismantled our mechanisms for combating foreign influence. If I'm Vladimir Putin and I have a wish list of U.S. policies that I want changed, like, it's Christmas in October. Like, he's gotten everything he wants. Beijing is a little less performative in its elation, but, China, and I'm going to get a little into the weeds here. Somebody stop me at some point. Like, their stated goal is very much to replace the United States as the hegemonic superpower in the world, largely so they can act unfettered in their immediate sphere of influence in East Asia and control the South China Seas and the Taiwan Straits and all the follow-on effects that will have on international trade to their benefit, but also really be able to what I can only term as like colonizing the third world in resource-rich areas. There's a reason that China is building bases in Africa and the Middle East and actively courting other individuals there. And for a long time, we were able to sort of pump the brakes on that by getting to countries first and building alliances. So, the Pacific trade agreement that was up for ratification during the first Trump administration that they refused to support, like, that would have given us a really solid block of nations whose economies were inextricably intertwined and whose national goals would have been in step with each other. So if China makes moves towards Taiwan or the Philippines or even India, their fate is tied up with all their other neighbors, and China's going to face a cohesive bloc. I don't think it's controversial to say that alliances are less important to this administration than previous ones, and we don't have that anymore. We're throwing tariffs, like punitive, outrageous tariffs, on countries like Vietnam and South Korea. Countries which we are going to need as military allies if China ever does try and cross the straits. Like, What we are seeing is the self-immolation of national interests in a way that has never occurred in any country before.
Any other question?
I'm a lot of fun at parties. Trust me. Yeah.
I wondered if you think there's a role for state and local investigators and prosecutors with the attorneys general offices, with inspectors general on the state level, with district attorneys to step up and fill some of this gap, whether directly on bribery and corruption, that kind of thing, or in some other ways?
In theory, yes. In practice, no, simply because they don't have the statutory authority to prosecute the sort of stuff that the FBI was traditionally looking at. Public corruption laws, white-collar laws, that's like a 50-state patchwork in terms of state-level offenses, so I can't really speak intelligently to whether they can fill the gap. I do know that state attorneys generals and district attorneys or state's attorneys do not have anywhere near the resources of the federal government to throw accountants and lawyers and financial analysts at the problem. So even if they try and fill the gap, there's just a capacity problem. With respect to foreign threats, whether terroristic or in terms of a foreign intelligence service, they have zero statutory authority and they have zero know-how. Counterintelligence, and this is like very much close to my heart, it's really a craft. It is something you spend a career learning, and you also have to learn a lot of things you wouldn't think, like history, the philosophy that gave rise to a foreign country's political structure. What are the cultural norms? What are the linguistic do's and don'ts? And I don't know of any state government which has the personnel. The Bureau sent me to Chinese school 5 summers in a row till I got to the point where I could conduct interviews and interrogations in Mandarin. I don't know of a state government that can afford to do that in terms of financial wherewithal or losing the person for the 3 months to go get trained.
And not only that, when it comes to counterintelligence, the states are really frankly, on the receiving/victim end of that problem. We have seen cases about Chinese operatives, for example, really working over state officials and really manipulating and using state officials to the benefit of China, to use one example, but it's hardly the only one. I mean, one of the interesting dynamics of what's happening right now is in the exodus of experience and people from the Justice Department especially, a lot of those people are going to DA's offices or state attorneys general offices. But Mike, I think you're absolutely right. That could produce some cases. It will produce nothing like the coverage and capability that the Bureau and DOJ have had as long as I've covered it. It is a lesser tool by far, but a lesser tool can still do some things. I can dig a ditch a lot slower than a backhoe can, but I can dig it. We may need more than a ditch.
I moved over to this side of the room. And any questions over here?
Mike, I just want to say, first of all, I admire the fact that you committed yourself to public service the way you did. You could easily have chosen the private sector and earned considerably more.
I think my family right now wishes that I had, so thank you.
We have a son in public service, so I admire what you've done. If somehow, well, let me ask you this. When you said you think the citizenry should know more about what's going on, to do what? I don't want to be fatalistic. There is no one right now who would stand up and try to check this group of people.
So I disagree somewhat with that.
Great, I'd love to know.
And look, I have practical advice, and then I have like a very philosophical theory about this. What I've been telling, look, there's a lot that's going on in this country that bothers me. We have a newborn son, and I am paranoid and freaked out he will not be able to get all of his vaccinations. But I'm not a healthcare expert. I have no background in medicine. that is not where I can add value to the conversation. I do know a lot about rule of law and national security. So to the extent I'm speaking in public and engaging in advocacy, I'm trying to stay laser focused on that and bring my knowledge to the world. So I am very much a believer. I'm very skeptical of mass protests, but I think that if individuals just choose one thing they really know about and are really passionate about, whether it's immigration, whether it's racial equity, and just laser focus on that, and don't try and cover the entire waterfront, but really devote energy and resources to one thing you care about, you actually can make a difference on a micro level. You might not change immigration policy, but you could escort an immigrant to their court hearing to make sure if they're kidnapped, somebody knows who it was done by. There are things we can do. But there's also something that people need to recognize. Like, anything worth value is going to have a cost. And unless people are willing to bear that cost, we're not going to get anywhere. It's real easy to post something on Blue Sky or Twitter and be clever and take somebody down with like a bon mot. But you need to be willing to do things that are going to make you uncomfortable and possibly at risk, whether it's reputational or financial, or in the realm of civil disobedience. And until people decide that they care enough to do that, I do share some of your fatalism. I mean, I'll speak for myself. Like, I speak Chinese. I have a law degree from a top 10 law school, and I was an FBI executive. I will never get a job in security consulting or with a clear defense contractor because I've chosen to spend the next year or two speaking out on this. And that's a cost I'm willing to bear. I think the stakes are important enough. But everybody who really cares about that needs to be able to look themselves in the mirror and make that hard choice. And until people get the courage to start doing that, I don't know that pushback is going to be effective.
Devlin, would you like to ask the last question?
Sure. I guess, Mike, what are you thinking about when it comes to the next year at the Bureau? Because I think one thing that strikes me is I don't think I've been super surprised by anything that's happened, except the pace of it. Mm-hmm. It's the changes that are happening maybe faster than I would have said I expect them to happen if you'd asked me in, say, January. Yeah. So what are you thinking about in terms of the next year at the Bureau?
I am trying to focus on what I can do to protect the parts of the workforce that want to do the right thing. Sometimes that's going to be calling out executives who are pressuring them to do the wrong thing. Sometimes it's going to be very quietly helping them get legal representation with an organization called Justice Connection that I'm working with now. Sometimes it's just going to be being a confidant when somebody needs to let something off their chest. But there are people who want to do the right thing, and I'm just trying to focus on doing what I can to support them so they could maybe hold the line for a day or a week longer.
Cheerful. I will just say, as a reporter who covers this stuff, I think of myself as a cheerful pessimist, which is that I generally think things will go badly, but it'll be okay because there's a lot of people who are grasping for reality still. I still have a basic faith in reality. And we'll find out if that faith is
Look, I should be clear because like doing this sort of circuit generally entails being very negative and despair-inducing. Like, all is not lost. It's just we're going to have to fight for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think my only closing thought would be, the Bureau has been embarked in what I think of as a 8-9 years and counting season of turmoil, and it's not over, and it's probably going to get more chaotic before it becomes something more like stable again, and it's going to keep changing. I think it is a time of tremendous, to call it creative destruction, I think would be not accurate description. But I don't think that means that this is the only state that the Bureau is going to be in. This is the only state that the DOJ is going to be in going forward. I think all those things are subject to change and subject to being run differently or being less chaotic and less alarming.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Devlin Barrett, Michael Feinberg, and I really want to thank you for your honesty and for being so forthcoming and not being afraid to just speak out and say what you'd like. We're doing a lot of these conversations at Hill Center. I urge you to join us. Thank you both so much.